The dust-laden wind carried the scent of sage and gunpowder as Delilah Everett stepped off the stagecoach onto the sun-baked street of Cottonwood Springs. Her knuckles were white around the handle of her worn leather valise, the only possession she'd managed to salvage from her previous life in Boston. The year was 1875, and the promise of a teaching position in this frontier town was her last hope after the banking collapse had taken everything her family owned. "Madam, you might want to move aside," called the stagecoach driver as he tossed down her trunk. "Don't want to be standing there when the cattle drive comes through." Delilah nodded her thanks and moved to the boardwalk, her high-buttoned boots clicking against the weathered wood. The town was smaller than she had imagined from the advertisement she'd answered, but after 3 days of bone-jarring travel, any destination seemed welcome. The schoolhouse was supposed to be at the north end of town, and she had been promised lodging with the widow Hanson until more suitable arrangements could be made. As she made her way down the street, Delilah felt the stares of the townspeople. A woman traveling alone was uncommon enough, but a woman of education wearing a Boston-tailored dress, however dusty and travel-worn, was a curiosity in these parts. She straightened her back and continued forward, determined not to show any uncertainty. The sound of thundering hooves and whooping cowboys came without warning. The cattle drive the driver had mentioned burst into the main street, a sea of longhorns with dust clouds billowing around them. Delilah pressed herself against the wall of the general store, her heart racing as the massive animals thundered past. A large steer broke away from the herd, veering directly toward the boardwalk where she stood. Frozen in fear, Delilah could only watch as the animal charged. Just as she braced for impact, a blur of movement caught her eye. A tall man on horseback swept between her and the steer, expertly turning the animal back toward the herd with his rope. "You all right, madam?" he called out, tipping his hat back to reveal intense blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. "Yes, thank you," Delilah managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Name's Tucker Zimmerman," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Most folks call me Tuck." He secured his horse to the hitching post and approached her, his spurs jingling with each step. "You must be the new schoolteacher." Delilah was startled by his accurate guess. "I am. Delilah Everett. How did you know?" A smile creased his tanned face, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "Small town. News travels fast, especially when it's about a lady coming from back east to teach our young'uns." He gestured to her trunk. "Need some help getting to Mrs. Hanson's place?" Before she could answer, a short, round woman with gray hair pulled into a tight bun bustled toward them. "Miss Everett, I'm Mrs. Hanson. I was on my way to meet you at the stage." She cast a sideways glance at Tucker. "I see you've met our local cattle baron." Tucker laughed, a rich sound that seemed to warm the air around them. "Hardly a baron, Mrs. Hanson. Just a man with a few hundred head and too much land to manage properly." He picked up Delilah's trunk as if it weighed nothing. "I'll carry this to your place if you don't mind." Mrs. Hanson nodded her approval, and the three of them began walking toward the north end of town. Delilah found herself sneaking glances at Tucker Zimmerman. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of the Boston men she'd known, but there was something compelling about his weathered features and the quiet confidence with which he moved. "The school board is mighty pleased to have found someone with your qualifications," Mrs. Hanson said, breaking into Delilah's thoughts. "Our last teacher left when she married a miner from Silver Creek. The children have been without proper schooling for nearly 3 months." "I'm eager to begin," Delilah replied. "When will I be able to see the schoolhouse?" "I can take you there tomorrow morning," Tucker offered. "I'm heading that way anyhow to check on a fence line." Mrs. Hanson's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's very neighborly of you, Mr. Zimmerman." Tucker shrugged. "Just being helpful, madam." They arrived at a neat whitewashed house with a small garden in front. Mrs. Hanson led them inside to a clean, simply furnished room at the back of the house. "This will be your quarters, Miss Everett. The privy is out back and we share the kitchen." "I've got supper almost ready if you're hungry from your journey," That's very kind, thank you. Delilah removed her bonnet and gloves, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look after days of travel. Tucker set down her trunk and tipped his hat. I'll leave you ladies to get settled. Miss Everett, I'll stop by tomorrow around 8 if that suits you for seeing the schoolhouse. After he left, Mrs. Hanson gave Delilah a meaningful look. Tucker Zimmerman is the most eligible bachelor in the county, owns the Lazy Z Ranch just outside of town. His father built it up from nothing before the war, and Tucker took over when old Mr. Zimmerman passed 5 years ago. He seems kind, Delilah said carefully. Kind isn't the half of it. Honest, hardworking, and God-fearing too, though he can be a bit abrupt at times. Mrs. Hanson paused her assessment to stir something on the stove. There's water for washing up if you like. Supper will be ready shortly. Left alone, Delilah sank onto the narrow bed, exhaustion washing over her. She hadn't expected to find herself in a place so different from Boston, nor to be immediately the subject of the town's interest. And she certainly hadn't expected to be rescued by a cowboy with eyes the color of the summer sky. The following morning, true to his word, Tucker arrived promptly at 8. Delilah had risen early, determined to make a better impression than she had the previous day. She wore a simple but neat blue calico dress, her chestnut hair pinned carefully at the nape of her neck. "Morning, Miss Everett," Tucker greeted her, hat in hand. He'd cleaned up as well, his chambray shirt and denims looking freshly pressed. "Ready to see your new domain?" They walked the short distance to the schoolhouse, a single-room building with a small bell tower. The morning was already warm, promising a scorching day ahead. Inside, the schoolhouse was plain but serviceable, with rows of benches and desks for the students, a larger desk for the teacher, and a blackboard along one wall. "It's not fancy," Tucker said, watching her face for a reaction. "But it's sturdy. Built it myself along with some of the other men in town 4 years back. You built this." Delilah ran her hand along one of the smooth desk tops. "The woodworking, yes, I've always been good with my hands." A slight flush colored his cheekbones. "My ma taught me to read when I was young, but I never had much formal schooling. It means something to me to make sure the children here get a proper education." Delilah felt a new appreciation for this man who valued learning despite his own limited opportunity. "It's a fine building, Mr. Zimmerman. I'm grateful to have such a well-constructed place to teach." "Tucker, please, or Tuck. Mr. Zimmerman makes me look around for my pa," he smiled, that dimple appearing again. "Tucker, then, and you must call me Delilah." She moved to the teacher's desk, already envisioning how she would organize her lessons. "When will I meet the school board?" "They're gathering tonight at the town hall. It's just the Reverend, the doctor, and myself, truth be told. We're a small operation." He leaned against one of the student desks. "How many students did they tell you to expect?" The letter mentioned 20, ranging from 6 to 15 years of age. "That's about right. Some might come from as far as 10 miles out, so attendance can be spotty during bad weather or harvest time." They spent the next hour discussing the peculiarities of frontier education, with Tucker providing insights about the families whose children would be in her care. His knowledge of the community was extensive, and he spoke of each family with genuine interest and respect. As they were leaving the schoolhouse, Tucker hesitated. "Miss Everett, Delilah, would you allow me to show you around town? Might help you get your bearings." "I'd appreciate that very much." They walked slowly down the main street, Tucker pointing out the various businesses and introducing her to people they encountered. The general store, the blacksmith, the small doctor's office, the telegraph office that doubled as the post office, and finally, the town's only restaurant, a modest establishment called the Silver Spoon. "Would you care to join me for dinner?" Tucker asked, gesturing to the restaurant. "They make a fine stew on Tuesdays." "I wouldn't want to inconvenience you," Delilah said, though in truth she was glad for the invitation. Mrs. Hanson had mentioned she would be visiting her sister until evening. No inconvenience at all. The warmth in his voice made her cheeks flush. Inside, the restaurant was simple but clean, with gingham curtains at the windows and oil lamps on each of the half-dozen tables. A plump woman with a friendly face approached them. Tucker Zimmerman, twice in 1 week, and with the new schoolteacher no less. She extended a hand to Delilah. "I'm Mabel Collins. My husband Frank does the cooking. Welcome to Cottonwood Springs." "Thank you, Mrs. Collins. It's a pleasure to meet you." "Just Mabel, honey. We don't stand on ceremony much here." She led them to a table by the window. "I'll bring you some coffee and the daily special." Once seated, Delilah found herself studying Tucker's face in the clear light streaming through the window. There were fine lines around his eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and a small scar just below his right temple. "How did you come to Cottonwood Springs?" he asked, catching her stare and holding it with his own. Delilah looked down at her hands. "Necessity, I'm afraid. My father was a banker in Boston. When the panic hit last year, he lost everything. He took his own life." The words still caught in her throat. "My mother followed him 3 months later, heart failure, the doctor said, but I think it was grief. I had been teaching at a ladies' academy, but without my parents' connections. She trailed off. When I saw the advertisement for a position out west, it seemed like providence." Tucker's hand moved across the table as if to touch hers, then retreated. "I'm sorry for your loss. It couldn't have been easy coming all this way alone." "It wasn't," she admitted, "but I find I'm stronger than I knew. I believe that." His eyes held a respect that warmed her more than any physical touch could have. Mabel returned with 2 steaming bowls of stew and a basket of fresh bread. As she set them down, Tucker automatically reached for the bread, then paused, looking at Delilah. "I usually say grace before meals," she said softly. Tucker's face colored slightly. "Of course. Please go ahead." Delilah bowed her head and whispered a simple prayer of thanks for the food and for new friendships in this unfamiliar place. When she looked up, Tucker was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My mother was religious," he said after a moment. "Always insisted on grace before meals. After she passed, Pa and I got out of the habit. Sometimes I forget, though it feels disrespectful not to remember." "Perhaps we can remember together," Delilah suggested, then immediately felt bold for assuming there would be other meals shared between them. But Tucker only smiled and nodded before turning his attention to his stew. The meal passed pleasantly, with Tucker telling stories of life on his ranch and the characters who made up the small community. Delilah found herself laughing more than she had in months, the weight of grief lifting slightly in the company of this forthright man. After they finished, Tucker insisted on paying, waving away her protests. "Consider it a welcome to Cottonwood Springs." Outside, the afternoon sun had softened, casting a golden glow over the town. They walked slowly back toward Mrs. Hanson's house, neither seeming in a hurry to end their time together. "Will I see you at the school board meeting tonight?" Delilah asked as they neared her temporary home. "You will, 7 o'clock at the town hall." He hesitated, then added, "I'm glad you came to Cottonwood Springs, Delilah Everett. I think you'll do just fine here." "Thank you, Tucker, for everything today." He tipped his hat and left her at Mrs. Hanson's gate, his tall figure cutting a distinctive silhouette against the setting sun. The school board meeting that evening was brief and cordial. Reverend Miller, a kindly man with spectacles perched on his nose, welcomed her warmly. Dr. Harrison, stern but fair, asked pointed questions about her teaching methods. And Tucker, now in his capacity as board member rather than tour guide, maintained a professional demeanor that somehow disappointed her. The school term would begin in 1 week, giving Delilah time to prepare her lessons and become acquainted with the town. As the meeting concluded, Tucker approached her. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low, "that you might want to meet some of your students before classes begin. I could take you around to a few of the outlying farms this weekend if you're amenable." "That would be very helpful," Delilah replied, trying to keep the eagerness from her voice. "I'll come by Saturday morning then, 9 o'clock. I'll be ready." The days leading up to Saturday passed in a blur of preparation. Delilah organized her teaching materials, cleaned the schoolhouse thoroughly, and began to feel a sense of purpose that had been missing since her parents' deaths. Mrs. Hanson proved to be a font of information about the community, filling in details about the families whose children would be in Delilah's care. Saturday dawned clear and bright. Delilah chose a practical riding skirt and blouse, knowing they would be traveling some distance. At precisely 9, there was a knock at the door. Tucker stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking more handsome than any man had a right to in simple ranch clothes. Beside him was a gentle-looking mare with a side saddle. "Thought you might prefer to ride rather than take the wagon," he explained. "It's a fair distance to some of the homesteads." "It's been some time since I've ridden," Delilah admitted, "but I'd prefer it to a wagon, yes." Tucker helped her mount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact sent a flutter through her that she quickly suppressed. She was here to teach, not to be distracted by a handsome cowboy, no matter how kind he might be. They rode out of town, the landscape opening up around them in a vast panorama of prairie and distant mountains. Tucker pointed out landmarks as they went, his deep voice carrying easily in the clear air. "That's the Lazy Z over there," he said, indicating a cluster of buildings nestled against a backdrop of cottonwoods. "We'll circle back there later if you'd like to see it." "I would," Delilah replied, curious about this man's home. Their first stop was a modest homestead where the Jensen family, a weather-beaten father, a tired-looking mother, and 4 children ranging from 6 to 12, welcomed them with shy curiosity. The children, especially, seemed fascinated by Delilah, the girls touching her skirt when they thought she wouldn't notice. "Miss Everett is going to be your new teacher," Tucker explained. "She's come all the way from Boston to help you learn your letters and numbers." "And history and science and literature," Delilah added with a smile. "There's a whole world beyond Cottonwood Springs that books can show you." The eldest Jensen girl, Emma, looked up with sudden interest. "Do you have books with stories in them?" "Ma reads to us from the Bible, but I've never had a storybook." "I do," Delilah assured her. "Stories about brave knights and clever girls, about far-off lands and amazing discoveries." By the time they left, all 4 children were eagerly anticipating the start of school, and Mrs. Jensen had pressed a jar of home-canned peaches into Delilah's hands in thanks. They visited 3 more families that morning, each interaction strengthening Delilah's resolve to provide these frontier children with the best education she could offer. Throughout, Tucker was a steady presence, clearly respected by the families they visited and genuinely interested in the children's welfare. As the sun climbed toward noon, they turned their horses toward the Lazy Z. "Thought we might stop for dinner," Tucker said. "My foreman's wife is a fine cook, and she always keeps something ready at midday." The ranch was larger than Delilah had expected, with a main house built of sturdy logs, a bunkhouse for the hands, several barns and corrals, and various outbuildings. A creek ran behind the property with a stand of cottonwoods providing shade. "It's beautiful," Delilah said sincerely. "You've built something remarkable here." "My pa did most of the building," Tucker replied, though he looked pleased at the compliment. "I've just tried not to run it into the ground." He helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. Inside, the main house was simply furnished but comfortable, with braided rugs on the plank floors and curtains at the windows. A woman in her 50s greeted them warmly. "Miss Everett, this is Mrs. Carmichael, our housekeeper and the wife of my foreman," Tucker introduced them. "She keeps everything running smoothly around here." "Welcome to the Lazy Z, Miss Everett," Mrs. Carmichael said. "I've got a chicken and dumplings on the stove if you're hungry from your ride." "That sounds wonderful, thank you." They ate in the kitchen, joined by Mr. Carmichael, a taciturn man who nevertheless had plenty to say about the ranch's operations and the coming fall roundup. Delilah was fascinated by the details of ranch life, so different from anything she'd known in Boston. After the meal, Tucker showed her around the property, ending at the creek where the cottonwoods rustled in the afternoon breeze. "My mother planted these trees," he said, resting a hand on one trunk. "She said they reminded her of home in Missouri. She never quite got used to how open everything is out here." "I can understand that," Delilah replied. "It's so vast it makes a person feel very small or very free." Tucker looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Do you miss Boston?" Delilah considered the question carefully. "I miss what Boston was before everything fell apart. The libraries, the concerts, the familiar streets, but that life is gone now, regardless of where I am. And there's something about this place." She gestured to the landscape around them. "It feels like a place where one could begin again. That's what my father always said, that the West was for people who needed a second chance." Tucker's voice softened. "Everyone here has a story, Delilah. Everyone has something they've left behind." "And what did you leave behind, Tucker Zimmerman?" The question slipped out before she could consider its propriety. His eyes clouded briefly. "Nothing worth mentioning. My life has always been here." He straightened, changing the subject. "We should start back if we want to reach town before dusk." The ride back was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Mrs. Hanson's house, Tucker finally broke the silence. "There's a social at the church next Friday evening. Sort of a welcome for you and a celebration before school starts. Would you allow me to escort you?" Delilah felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I would like that very much." "Good." His smile returned, transforming his face. "I'll come by at 7. The week leading up to the social was busy with final preparations for school. Delilah organized her classroom, labeled books, and wrote out lesson plans for the various age groups she would be teaching. Mrs. Hanson helped her alter one of her dresses for the social, adding a bit of lace at the collar that had belonged to Mrs. Hanson's daughter. "He hasn't escorted anyone to a social in years," Mrs. Hanson commented as she stitched. "Not since that business with the Blackwood girl." "What business?" Delilah couldn't help asking. Mrs. Hanson pursed her lips. "Not my place to say, really, just that there was a young lady he was sweet on and it ended badly. He's kept to himself since then, focused on the ranch." She tied off her thread. "But he seems different around you, lighter somehow." Delilah didn't know how to respond, so she simply thanked Mrs. Hanson for her help with the dress. Friday evening arrived, and with it a flutter of nerves that Delilah hadn't felt since her debut in Boston society years ago. She dressed carefully in her newly altered blue dress, arranging her hair in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Tucker arrived promptly at 7, wearing a clean black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. "These are for you," he said, handing her the flowers. "Nothing fancy, just some I found by the creek." "They're lovely," Delilah replied, touched by the gesture. "Thank you." Mrs. Hanson provided a small jar for the flowers, then shooed them on their way with a knowing smile. The church was lit with lanterns, casting a warm glow over the gathering inside. It seemed the entire town had turned out, eager to meet the new schoolteacher and enjoy a rare social occasion. Delilah was introduced to dozens of people, trying to remember names and faces that would soon become familiar. Throughout the evening, Tucker remained at her side, a steady presence in the swirl of new acquaintances. When the music began, provided by a fiddler, a banjo player, and an elderly man with a harmonica, Tucker turned to her with a question in his eyes. "Would you care to dance, Miss Everett?" "I would, Mr. Zimmerman." She placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses on his palm as he led her to the cleared space serving as a dance floor. The music was lively, a far cry from the formal waltzes of Boston ballrooms, but Delilah found herself enjoying the simpler steps and the way Tucker guided her confidently through them. He was an excellent dancer, moving with the same fluid grace he showed on horseback. "You dance well for a cowboy," she teased as he twirled her. "My mother insisted I learn," he replied with a grin. "Said no son of hers was going to clod around a dance floor like a newborn calf." They danced 3 dances in succession, then stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the sky a canopy of stars brighter than any Delilah had seen in Boston. "It's beautiful," she breathed, gazing upward. "It is," Tucker agreed, but when she looked at him, he was watching her, not the stars. "Delilah," whatever he had been about to say, was interrupted by Reverend Miller calling everyone inside for refreshments. The moment broken, they returned to the church, where tables had been set up with punch and an assortment of cakes and cookies baked by the women of the congregation. As they enjoyed the refreshments, Delilah noticed a striking woman watching them from across the room. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with raven hair and a dress more fashionable than most of the women present. "Who is that?" Delilah asked quietly. Tucker followed her gaze, his expression tightening slightly. "Victoria Blackwood. Her father owns the largest mercantile in the county, over in Silver Creek." Before Delilah could ask more, Victoria approached them, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Tucker, how good to see you at a social event. It's been too long." She turned to Delilah. "And you must be the new schoolteacher everyone's talking about. I'm Victoria Blackwood." "Delilah Everett. A pleasure to meet you, Miss Blackwood." "Mrs. Blackwood, actually, though not for much longer." "My husband passed last winter." She placed a hand on Tucker's arm. "Tucker and I are old friends. We grew up together, didn't we?" "Our fathers did business together," Tucker confirmed, his tone neutral. "I'm sorry about James, Victoria. He was a good man." Victoria's smile turned sad. "Yes, he was, but life goes on, doesn't it?" She squeezed Tucker's arm before releasing it. "Don't be such a stranger, Tucker. Silver Creek isn't so far away." With a nod to Delilah, she moved on to greet others. An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Tucker spoke. "Victoria and I were engaged once, a long time ago." "Mrs. Hanson mentioned something about a Blackwood girl," Delilah admitted. "Did she?" Tucker's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "Small towns, nothing stays private for long," he took a breath. "It was 8 years ago. I was 22, she was 20. We'd known each other all our lives, and it seemed expected somehow. But then she met James Blackwood, a lawyer from Denver with money and education, things I didn't have," he shrugged. "She made her choice, can't say I blame her." "I'm sorry," Delilah said softly. "Don't be, it was for the best." He met her eyes directly. "I wouldn't have met you otherwise." The simple statement hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Before Delilah could respond, they were surrounded by children asking for a story. The moment passed, but Delilah carried his words with her for the rest of the evening. As the social wound down, Tucker escorted her back to Mrs. Hanson's house. The streets were quiet, most of the town still at the church or already tucked into their homes for the night. "Thank you for a lovely evening," Delilah said as they reached Mrs. Hanson's gate. "I enjoyed meeting everyone." "The pleasure was mine," Tucker replied. He hesitated, then reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "Delilah, I know you've only been in Cottonwood Springs a short time, and I don't want to presume, but I find myself thinking about you more than is probably proper." Delilah's heart quickened. "I think about you too, Tucker." His smile was slow and warm. "Then may I call on you properly?" "Sunday after church, perhaps?" "I'd like that very much." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Good night, Delilah Everett." "Good night, Tucker Zimmerman." She watched him walk away, his tall figure disappearing into the shadows before entering the house with her thoughts in a pleasant jumble. The following Monday, school began. 23 students ranging from 6 to 16 filed into the schoolhouse, some excited, some nervous, all curious about their new teacher. Delilah had prepared thoroughly, dividing them into groups based on age and ability, setting the older students to help the younger ones when needed. By the end of the first week, she had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. The children were eager to learn, even those who had initially seemed resistant. She introduced them to poetry and literature, mathematics and science, finding ways to relate their lessons to the world they knew while broadening their horizons. Tucker came by the schoolhouse each afternoon, ostensibly to check if she needed anything, though they both knew his visits had more to do with seeing her than with school board business. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a jar of honey from his hives, a book he thought she might enjoy, wildflowers picked along the way. They began taking Sunday afternoon rides after church, exploring the countryside around Cottonwood Springs. Tucker showed her his favorite places: a hidden meadow filled with wildflowers, a cliff overlooking the valley, a secluded spot by the river where he liked to fish. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their disappointments. As autumn progressed, Delilah found herself falling in love with the land as much as with the man. The vast skies, the changing colors of the prairie, the sharp clarity of the air, all of it spoke to something in her soul that had been stifled in Boston. And Tucker. Tucker was unlike any man she had known. Straightforward in his speech but complex in his thinking, rough-hewn in his appearance but gentle in his actions. He treated her with a respect that had nothing to do with social conventions and everything to do with genuine admiration. One Sunday in late October, they rode to a high ridge overlooking the lazy Z. The cottonwoods along the creek had turned golden, their leaves shimmering in the afternoon sun. They dismounted to enjoy the view, spreading a blanket on the ground for a simple picnic Tucker had packed. As they ate, Tucker grew uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, he set aside his plate and turned to face her. "Delilah, there's something I need to tell you." His voice was serious, his blue eyes troubled. "About Victoria." Delilah's heart sank. She had seen Victoria at church several times since the social, always watching them with an expression that seemed calculating rather than friendly. "What about her?" Tucker took a deep breath. "She's been coming by the ranch, talking about old times, suggesting that now she's a widow we might revisit what we had." He met Delilah's eyes directly. "I want you to know that I've made it clear to her that's not going to happen. My feelings for her died a long time ago." Relief washed through Delilah. "Thank you for telling me. There's more." He reached for her hand. "The reason I was so certain in turning her away is that my heart belongs to someone else now. Someone who whispers grace at dinner and teaches children about faraway places and looks at the stars like they're speaking directly to her soul." Delilah's breath caught. "Tucker. I love you, Delilah Everett. I know it's soon, and I know a schoolteacher from Boston could do a sight better than a rough cowboy like me. But if you could find it in your heart to give me a chance, I swear I'd spend every day trying to make you happy." Tears pricked at Delilah's eyes. "Oh, Tucker, I love you too, more than I thought possible after so short a time." His face lit with joy, and he leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Delilah met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that started gently and quickly deepened with shared passion. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Tucker rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have fancy words like the men you knew in Boston, but I promise you this: I'll love you honest and true for all my days." "That's all I could ever want," Delilah whispered, her heart fuller than she had ever known it could be. They returned to town late that afternoon, both glowing with the joy of new love acknowledged. Mrs. Hanson took one look at them and smiled knowingly, but said nothing beyond inviting Tucker to stay for supper. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a sweet courtship. Tucker came for supper at Mrs. Hanson's 3 times a week, and they continued their Sunday rides. They were discreet in public, mindful of Delilah's position as the town's teacher, but the glow between them was hard to hide. Word spread, as it always does in small towns, and Delilah was pleased to find that the community seemed supportive of their relationship. Mrs. Jensen commented that it was about time Tucker Zimmerman found himself a good woman, and Reverend Miller spoke pointedly about the blessings of matrimony in his sermon. Only Victoria Blackwood seemed displeased, her smile tightening whenever she saw them together at church. But even she eventually stopped coming to Cottonwood Springs, returning to her life in Silver Creek. As Thanksgiving approached, Tucker invited Delilah to dinner at the ranch. "The Carmichaels always put on a spread," he explained, "and I'd like you to see the place as well as if it might someday be your home too." The implication made Delilah's heart skip. "I'd love to come." Thanksgiving Day dawned bright and cold. Tucker arrived with his buggy to pick up Delilah, who had spent extra time on her appearance, wearing her best dress, a burgundy wool with black piping that Mrs. Hanson had helped her refresh with new buttons. The Lazy Z was festive for the holiday, with pine boughs decorating the mantel and the delicious scents of roasting turkey and baking pies filling the air. The Carmichaels welcomed her warmly, as did the half-dozen ranch hands who would be joining them for the meal. Mrs. Carmichael had outdone herself with the feast turkey and ham, mashed potatoes and gravy, sweet potatoes with maple, green beans, cornbread, cranberry sauce, and 3 different kinds of pie. Everything was laid out on the long table in the main room, which had been extended with boards to accommodate everyone. As they gathered around the table, Tucker, at the head as master of the ranch, suddenly looked uncertain. He glanced at Delilah, then cleared his throat. "Before we begin, he stopped, his face coloring slightly. "I'd like to give thanks, but I'm not good with words like that." Without hesitation, Delilah bowed her head and whispered a grace for all of them, thanking God for the bounty before them, for the companionship they shared, and for bringing her to this place where she had found not only purpose but love. When she finished and looked up, Tucker was watching her with such tenderness that it nearly took her breath away. "Thank you," he said softly. The meal was joyous, with stories and laughter flowing as freely as the cider. Delilah felt, for the first time since her parents' deaths, that she had found a place where she truly belonged. After dinner, as the others relaxed in various states of contentment, Tucker took her hand. "Come with me. There's something I want to show you." He led her outside and around to the back of the house where a small garden lay dormant for winter. In the center stood a bench beneath an arbor, which would be covered with climbing roses in summer. "My mother's garden," Tucker explained. "It's pretty in spring." He guided her to the bench. "This is where my father proposed to her. Said he knew right away she was the only woman for him, but he waited a whole year to ask because he wanted to be sure she felt the same." Delilah's pulse quickened as Tucker knelt before her, taking both her hands in his. "I'm not as patient as my father," he said with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I've known since that first day at the Silver Spoon when you bowed your head and whispered grace for us both, that you were the woman I wanted to spend my life with. I love you, Delilah Everett. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy spilled down Delilah's cheeks. "Yes, Tucker, yes, with all my heart." He slipped a ring onto her finger, a simple gold band with a small pearl. "It was my mother's. I had it sized for you. It's perfect." She pulled him up to sit beside her, kissing him with all the love she felt. Absolutely perfect. They were married on Christmas Eve in the little church of Cottonwood Springs, with the entire town in attendance. Delilah wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Hanson and the other women had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Tucker, looking both nervous and proud, waited for her at the altar in his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his blue eyes shining with love. Reverend Miller conducted the ceremony, speaking of love's endurance and the building of a life together. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Tucker kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The celebration afterward in the church hall was festive, with music and dancing and food contributed by everyone in town. As Delilah and Tucker moved among their friends and neighbors, accepting congratulations and well wishes, she marveled at how completely this community had embraced her in the few months since her arrival. Late that night, Tucker brought her home to the Lazy Z, now her home as well. The Carmichaels had discreetly retired to their quarters, leaving the main house to the newlyweds. A fire crackled in the hearth, and someone had placed candles throughout the room, casting a warm, golden glow. Tucker lifted her in his arms to carry her over the threshold, setting her down gently inside. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zimmerman." The name sent a thrill through her. "It sounds wonderful when you say it." He cupped her face in his hands. I still can't believe you chose me, Delilah. A Boston lady with education and refinement choosing a rough cowboy. Not so rough, she corrected, placing her hands over his. And it wasn't a choice, Tucker. It was simply recognizing what my heart already knew, that you are the man I was meant to find. Their kiss was deep and passionate, a promise of the night to come and the lifetime they would build together. Spring came to the Lazy Z, bringing new life in every sense. The cottonwoods leafed out in pale green, wildflowers carpeted the prairie, and Delilah's morning sickness confirmed what they had both begun to suspect: a child would join their family before the year was out. Tucker's joy at the news was boundless. He insisted on accompanying her to see Dr. Harrison, peppered the doctor with questions, and began making plans for a nursery in the room adjacent to their bedroom. "Boy or girl doesn't matter to me," he told her as they lay in bed one night, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Healthy is all I care about. Though I wouldn't mind a little girl with your eyes and spirit. And I wouldn't mind a boy with your kindness and integrity," Delilah replied, covering his hand with hers. "But you're right, healthy is what matters." Delilah continued teaching through the spring term, though she and the school board had agreed that she would take a leave of absence once the baby arrived. Several of the older girls had expressed interest in teaching, and Delilah had begun training them to assist in the classroom, seeing in their enthusiasm echoes of her own early love for education. Summer passed in a blur of ranch work for Tucker and preparation for the baby for Delilah. They converted the spare room into a nursery, with Tucker building a cradle from cottonwood that he had been seasoning for years. Mrs. Carmichael and the women from town helped with baby clothes and blankets, sharing advice and old wives' tales about determining the baby's gender. As autumn approached and Delilah's time grew near, Tucker became increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and take no risks. She indulged his concern, touched by his devotion, though she sometimes had to remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time. "Not my wife," he would reply. "Not my child." Their daughter, Grace Eleanor Zimmerman, was born on a crisp October morning with Dr. Harrison in attendance and Mrs. Carmichael assisting. After hours of labor, during which Tucker wore a path in the floorboards of the hallway outside their bedroom, Delilah's exhausted cry of triumph was followed by the thin wail of a newborn. When Tucker was finally allowed in, he approached the bed with awe, looking at his wife and daughter as if they were miracles he could scarcely comprehend. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the tiny hand that emerged from the swaddling. "Just like her mother." Delilah, tired but radiant, shifted the bundle so he could see their daughter's face. "Would you like to hold her?" Tucker's hands, so confident with ropes and reins, trembled slightly as he took his daughter. "Hello, little Grace," he murmured. "I'm your pa." The baby's eyes, still the unfocused blue of all newborns, seemed to find his face. One tiny hand escaped the blanket, and Tucker offered his finger, which she grasped with surprising strength. "She's got a good grip," he said with a chuckle. "Might make a fine roper someday." "Or a teacher," Delilah suggested, "or anything else she sets her mind to." Tucker nodded, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. "That's right. In this family, you can be whatever you dream of being, little one." In that moment, looking at her husband cradling their child with such tenderness, Delilah's heart felt too full for her chest. The journey that had brought her to this place, to these people, had begun in grief and uncertainty, but had led to a joy more profound than she had ever imagined possible. The years that followed were not without challenges. Drought threatened the ranch one summer, and a harsh winter 2 years later claimed some of their cattle. Grace was joined by a brother, Thomas, when she was 3, and another sister, Emma, 2 years after that. Each child brought new joys and worries, but through it all, the foundation of Tucker and Delilah's love remained solid. Delilah eventually returned to teaching, but on her own terms, holding classes for the ranch children and others nearby 3 days a week, allowing her to balance her passion for education with her role as a mother and ranch wife. She started a small library at the Lazy Z, ordering books from back east and encouraging a love of reading in her children and any others who showed interest. Tucker expanded the ranch operations, breeding horses as well as cattle, and gaining a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. He served on the town council and later as mayor for 2 terms, helping to guide Cottonwood Springs as it grew from a frontier outpost to a proper town with a bank, a newspaper, and eventually a railroad spur. And every evening, without fail, when the family gathered for dinner, Tucker would look to Delilah before they began. Sometimes he would say grace himself, the words coming easier to him as the years passed. But often, he would simply nod to her, and she would bow her head and whisper a prayer of thanks for them, all a moment of communion that had first drawn them together and continued to bind their family in love. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire town came together to celebrate at the Lazy Z. Their children, now young adults, organized the event. Grace, as practical and determined as her father, Thomas, with his mother's love of books and ideas, and Emma, artistic and free-spirited, a blend of them both. As the sun set over the land they had nurtured together, Tucker took Delilah's hand and led her to the bench in what was now a flourishing garden, the roses on the arbor in full bloom. 25 years, he marveled, his hair now silver at the temples but his blue eyes as bright as ever. Did you ever think, that day you stepped off the stagecoach, that this is where you'd end up? Delilah leaned her head against his shoulder. Never, but I wouldn't change a single moment of the journey. Not even that first awkward dinner when I forgot to say grace and you had to whisper it for us both. His lips quirked in the smile that still made her heart skip. Especially not that, she replied, turning to face him. That was the moment I first saw the true heart of Tucker Zimmerman, a man willing to acknowledge what mattered to others, even when it wasn't his custom. She touched his face gently. I fell a little in love with you right then. Tucker's arms encircled her waist, and I with you. Though it took me a while longer to admit it. Not so very long, Delilah reminded him. You were never one to waste time once you made up your mind. Best decision I ever made. He kissed her softly. I love you, Delilah Zimmerman, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. And I love you, Tucker Zimmerman, for all my days and beyond. As they rejoined their celebration, surrounded by family, friends, and the community they had helped build, Delilah reflected on the strange and wonderful path her life had taken. From the tragedy that had driven her from Boston to the joy she had found in this wild and beautiful land, with this man who had captured her heart with his integrity, his kindness, and his enduring love. The night deepened, stars appearing in the vast western sky, and around the tables set up in the yard of the Lazy Z, lanterns glowed like earthbound stars, illuminating faces young and old, all connected in the web of community that Delilah and Tucker had helped to strengthen over the years. And when Tucker rose to propose a toast, his voice steady and sure, Delilah knew that the grace she had whispered that day long ago had been answered 1,000 times over in the life they had built together, a life of purpose, of love, and of abiding faith in each other.